Welcome to Revolution Against Evolution. I'm your host, Doug Sharp, and this is my friend Dan Janzen. He is a missionary to South Sudan, and we are also welcoming Teresa Janzen, his wife, by way of Zoom today. And we're going to talk a little bit about engaging this hostile culture that we have that is really rapidly falling away from Christianity, and trying to be relevant to this culture that we're experiencing right now. It's really a dismaying thing for me, because I'm seeing a lot of the things that I value in my life starting to really erode away rapidly. And so Teresa's been doing some studying on this issue, and Dan, we appreciate you because you two, because you are doing a big work in South Sudan, and in the area of agriculture, and also in bringing literacy to that part of the world. So, Dan, tell us a little bit of what you are experiencing, and introduce us to your wife.
Okay, sure. I think what precipitated this is my wife Teresa, lovely wife Teresa Janzen. She's beginning her DNN Doctor of Ministry degree at Fuller, and she's been reading a book called Canoeing the Mountains, and being inspired by it, written by one of her professors, and then also just coming back and seeing the world changing every time we come back. Even a year later, it seems like things are different, and then this time we've had a lot of meetings with different churches that support us, small churches that are diminishing in numbers, and discussions about, well, why is the church losing numbers, and what is happening, and how do we deal with this, and how do we become more relevant to the world in the way that the churches interact with the community.
And Teresa, tell us a little bit about your project that you're starting right now.
Hi, Doug, and it's great to join you on Revolution Against Evolution. I am beginning my DMin program at Fuller Theological Seminary, like Dan had said, and the program is on leading change. The book that Dan mentioned is actually written by the professor of the program, and I always advise students to always study their professor. So the first book I decided to read was Dr. Bolsinger's book, Canoeing the Mountains, but it just kind of framed what we have been seeing these last few years. Every time we come to the United States, we get a snapshot of the culture. But people who live in the United States all the time, they're like that proverbial frog in a pot with the temperature rising, and they may not see it as readily as those of us who just enter occasionally and get that snapshot. And every time we see that snapshot, the change is more evident. It seemed to start during the pandemic, but the reality is it started long before that, and the political things that were going on. What we're experiencing is actually what they call a post-Christendom environment. We've been riding the coattails of the Reformation movement and the things that generated a worldview that was based on Christian principles, even if people didn't realize that's what the worldview was based on. It's one of the reasons why Americans have such a hard time differentiating their political or even patriotic sense from their faith. And people do have a hard time differentiating, because the American ideology was very much rooted in biblical worldview, even when people didn't know it. But that is rapidly falling away. Not only is it falling away, people are becoming ambivalent to faith, or especially the church, because they've seen too much hypocrisy and too many, false images, and not the authenticity that really is what Christian faith is all about. People are really craving authenticity. The fastest growing religion in the world today, or fastest growing self-proclamation of faith, is people who say that they are spiritual but non-religious. So people still have an idea that they need faith, but they don't want the church. So what is the role of the church today? How can they engage their community in an impactful way? That's kind of what we'd like to discuss today.
Well, I find it interesting that Rich and I and you guys came a little bit later than the Jesus People movement of the 60s and the 70s, but that's the environment that we grew up in, where we had a revival. It was a situation where we saw a lot of lives radically transformed, saw some miracles and healings, and a lot of real positive things that happened during that time. And then there was some false doctrine that crept in, and there was a lot of little things that poisoned the well, if you know what I mean. And I think there is a lot of what we have in the church today was riding on the remnants of that crest that happened in the 1960s and 70s, and that we haven't really kept up with what is really going on in the world and the culture today, and where people are coming from, because the culture that we grew up in, we had the assumption of Christianity, but it was where it got revived and it got turned on. We're dealing with a Greek culture, a pagan culture that has gone really sour to the even wanting to hear about the gospel, because they don't even have an idea of what sin is, or an idea that there is consequences for sin. And so if you use terms like that, they don't understand.
That's absolutely right, Doug. And I think that what you just said, even though it sounds terrible, should provide us with a little bit of hope. This is not the first time that we're seeing this. It's not the first time that Christians have been a minority. It's not in a particular location, especially. And it's not the first time that we've really faced people who are saying, what's the point? What are you doing? It just looks like a bunch of stuffy rules. And the unfortunate thing is if our faith looks like a bunch of rules to people, what kind of faith is that we're exhibiting? We should be living the most joyous, vibrant, full life, and it should be attractive to people. And if the church life has not become attractive to people, we have to ask ourselves why. In that book I was talking about, I love the analogy that the author uses. He uses the Lewis and Clark expedition, in which they were setting out to find a water passage to the Pacific Ocean. And they successfully navigated the first portion of their journey up the Missouri River because they were expert river navigators. When they got to the source of the Missouri River, they fully expected that the route that laid in front of them would look like the one that was behind them. But when they crested the hill, rather than finding another river, what they found was the Rocky Mountains. They had to get out of the boat. Not only did they have to get out of the boat, they had to find a whole new skill set to navigate what was in front of them. And that's exactly the point that we are corporately as a church, but also individually. Individually, how can we embrace a faith that is attractive to our neighbor, and how can we draw our neighbor in? How can we engage in conversations? It's not going to be with a rule book, I can tell you that. It's going to have to be with something that will meet people at their point of need, at their point of pain, and let them see that there is an authentic solution. And we can only do that in relationship.
So can you describe to us what you think that might look like in modern day evangelism versus what we have been trying for the last 20 or 30 years?
I think that what we've been doing for the last 20 or 30 years, we come up with different systems. The Roman road, or I don't even know the names of all these systems, but people teach a methodology in how to evangelize someone. And I have come up with my own, and it's really, really complicated. Are you ready for this, Doug?
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay. You sit down with someone, you start up a conversation, you ask them how they're doing, and then you listen. I think you can't miss that listening step. And that's what a lot of people do. They want to jump into telling someone what's the solution to all their problems before they've even listened to what the problem is. Because people, they say people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. That has never been more true. You listen to people, identify them, hear where they're coming from, and then you earn the opportunity in relationship to tell them where you have come from and where you are today and what happened in the middle. And that was the saving grace of Jesus Christ. Now, if someone hasn't had a transformational relationship, a transformational experience in their own life, something where they can look back and they say, my life used to be full of fear, anxiety, worry, whatever it was. And today, my life is full of joy. My life is full of excitement. My life is full of purpose. So if you don't have that before, after experience, then you first need to have some time of self-reflection and see where you are with the Lord. And renew that first love. And then you'll have an experience you can share with people.
I think there's a little warning there with that too, is that the life of a Christian is not always a bed of roses.
Yeah.
When you become a Christian, you can expect a little bit of trouble to come along, and that's the one thing that a lot of young people who make a commitment to the Lord find out very quickly that they will encounter some opposition to their faith. And if they're not prepared for that, they may soon fall away because they encounter some peer pressure and some difficulties that make their faith difficult. And so, and it doesn't take much to dissuade a young person if they end up with a disappointment or a heartache, or someone doesn't like them, or they find somebody who is that looks at them the wrong way in church. It's a difficulty. Now, Dan, I suppose you have some ideas about how to engage people. You engage people through your like planting orchards or different trees or things of that sort, and you do agriculture, and you work with people, and you work alongside them. Tell us about how that works.
Well, I think the holistic approach to the gospel is really important here, because in agriculture is just one part. It's what's relevant to the needs of the people where they're at, and some part of that is maybe subsistence, another part is income generation. And so if we're relevant to the needs that the world has, and around the world, income generation is a really important need. And what I've seen in certain places like Moyo, Uganda, we hear about the Muslims come in with their business opportunities, extending them to the local Ugandans, and people become Muslim because they're looking for an opportunity. So what if Christianity was relevant enough that in the churches we had training on business and mentoring and apprenticeships formed through the church, and various types of relationships that were coming together in the church, not people going to church to just to do business or find business partners, but where we're addressing the needs of the poorest of the poor, and we're becoming relevant to them, and this is what we do. This is our experience overseas, is using the church as a place to train and to bring people together, and to also study, what is holding people back, what are the Christian worldview issues that are misaligned, and we can realign those to where we are in proper relationship with God and relationship with each other, and we're removing the barriers to and the oppression of sin in people's lives. We bring that all together. It's holistic, and that's a counterpart of maybe what we need here too in the United States and the Western countries. Is what is it that's relevant to people in the inner city, or all these various cultures that we find now, the young person culture. There's so many different types of culture. What's relevant to them, and how can we become more relevant and holistic in our approach? What are the issues they're concerned about? And does Christianity have a reasonable explanation? And I think that's why we're kind of mixed. We're also looking at the reasoning in questions that young people are asking, or people are asking about origins and creation too. It all kind of comes in a holistic context.
Yeah, I find that what our church is doing is we established a group called the King's Club, and we meet every month as Christian business owners, and we mentor new startup businesses how to apply Christian principles to their business practices. And I think it's a great concept to be able to take what you learn in the Bible and extend it towards how you conduct yourself in your everyday life. That's really where the rubber meets the road. You have to be able to apply something that's real and tangible to your. It's not all this spiritual. Get your emotions all up and come to church and sing a few songs and listen to a guy talk and watch the back of the head of the guy in front of you. If you can have people engaging under the people, you are able to then do some work where you actually accomplish something and make a difference.
I think you have a good point, Doug, about it being what's relevant in a person's everyday life. Oftentimes we get sidetracked by the big issues, the things that are hitting the media, and those big issues certainly are important. But if we make those big issues the main issue, we miss what is really the main issue, and that is the human being right in front of us, regardless of what they look like, even regardless of some of their behavior, because Jesus Christ meets a person where they are. It doesn't matter what is happening in their life at that point of the beginning of that relationship. And we cannot, as a mature Christian, expect that person to instantaneously look like a mature Christian. It's a process. But we tend to get so judgmental about people, focusing in on something that looks very disturbing, even to us or from our standpoint, without seeing the person and what they're actually going through and what are they experiencing. So there's these dual side of ministering to Christians at all stages of their growth, the businessman and his business, the young person and their confusion and all of the things that's going on in their life, the parent and the helpless feeling that they have in raising their children in this environment today. How can we address the root of the issues? We have to ask the question why. And Dan does a training in South Sudan, and it's the same thing here in the United States. You have to ask that question why, not once, but you have to keep asking why. and why and why. So in South Sudan, it looks like something like the family is hungry. Why is the family hungry? Because they're not producing enough food. Why are they not producing enough food? Because there's insecurity in the area. Why is there insecurity in the area? And you have to keep asking those whys until you get to the root of the situation. And we tend to stop at the surface because we see behavior that may even be alarming. And if instead we get to the root of what is happening in a person's life, we'll find that it is based on the same type of emptiness and longing that people have until they meet the Savior. And then they can begin building from there.
Now, when you meet the Savior, then what is that happens that does the transformation? Because even if a person has Jesus Christ in their hearts, they need some teaching. They need some training of how to apply what they know what in their heart is what is right to do, but they still are dealing with their own sin and can't get beyond it. And so unless there is teaching and training to bring about that transformation, then you have a little bit of a lag time between actually getting a problem solved and the time where you commit to yourself to Christ.
That's a really good point, Doug. And I think that can be a tricky spot for churches and for individuals, especially for churches as a corporate body. I think when it's individuals dealing with people individually, then we have a little bit more room and time to take those relationships one by one. But corporately, as a church body, those are serious and difficult roads to navigate, maybe even mountains to navigate. And that's where we have to say the canoe isn't going to work here anymore. So what will? And the real test of a leader, and this is what my doctoral program is about, looks very different from what it used to. Because a Christian leader used to look like someone who maybe was in the front of a church or the head of an organization. But a leader in this very dynamic environment that we find ourselves in today is a person who can lead a discussion, lead groups of people to get involved. It's not the job of just the guy at the pulpit or the guy in the big chair in the corner office of the ministry to try and solve these problems. Each and every Christian should be doing the work of what we call discipleship. Now, when we use that word outside of the church, people don't know what that means, but it's exactly what you just described. Someone who is walking alongside a newer Christian, helping them learn to navigate the path in front of them. I'm always grateful when God chooses to miraculously free people from the burdens that have had them bound up before they came to Christ, but it doesn't happen that way all the time. This is something that is a process where people have to break addiction and bad habits and emotions and all of these things that have come along with them into their new life. It doesn't just vanish. And as long as we don't pretend that it just vanishes, we can be authentic and real with one another. There's hope that we can move forward in a humble way. The church needs to practice humility and authenticity because that's what builds the trust that relationships can really be formed on.
Mount Hope Church has a leadership training program which started about 1983 or 84, and I've been watching how that leadership training program grew that church from like 250 people to now about 4,000 people today. And even with COVID, there's a strong sense that the church is still strong and able to weather the storms because they had leadership training. They take people through their growth track, and and give the new Christians a foundation, and then those and everyone is encouraged to go into leadership training, because everybody is a leader in something, and so it is something that I think that has been applied, and I've seen it work. However, I think that there are new challenges that have come up that we need to address even beyond that, where our culture is different than it was years ago, and we have to address the fact that we have to start at a different beginning spot and go from there. It's where we as creationists, we're the ones who are digging out the stumps, cutting down the trees, digging out the stumps, taking all the rocks out, and hauling away the wood, so that then we have a field where we can plant the seeds and have them watered and grow. But unless the forest and the woods and all the confusion is taken and gotten rid of, that watering and planting can't occur.
I'm really glad that you talked about doing that work of digging out the stumps and the rocks and all that type of thing, because that's work that can be uncomfortable sometimes. And one of the skills that's really important in this day and age is that Christians get comfortable with the uncomfortable. We have to be willing to engage in conversation, not saying that someone is right. I'm not talking about compromising truth, but I'm talking about getting into finding out what lies beneath. And so you do have to do some digging. Things always eventually end up back in the garden. And that's why this work of creation science, I think, is really interesting. It doesn't matter where you read in the Bible. Eventually, you're going to find yourself back in Genesis. If you look for what came before that, what caused that, and it goes back to Genesis, and it goes back to the garden, the relationship between man and his creator, and the relationship between man and creation. And that's where it falls.
Well, I think those who are in leadership in the church need to be aware that there's a lot that has to be reconsidered in our approach to evangelism. And we'll see you next time on Revolution Against Evolution. Thank you, Dan and Teresa, for joining us today.